7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. Starting in our neighbor to the north, Canada has announced a new plan to go to zero emissions by 2050 in an attempt to shift away from fossil fuels. Unveiled on November 19th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau outlined his plans to slowly shift Canada into green and clean energy. His plan is for the government to come up with new ranges for emissions every 5 years so that they can completely eliminate emissions by 2050. He did not lay out any means for funding or enforcement, but if his plan passes, then Canada will be forced to set and maintain their renewed goals. Advocates are saying this could be a huge first step towards combating climate change. Further south, at least 30 people were killed after Hurricane Iota passed over Central America. Tens of thousands more have been left homeless. Nicaragua, which is still recovering from the impact of Hurricane Eta over 2 weeks ago, bore the brunt of Iota. Deaths from the storm have also been reported in El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, and Colombia. Hurricane Iota is the strongest Atlantic hurricane of the year and is only the second hurricane ever to become a Category 5 storm in November. The last time this happened was in 1932. The 2020 Atlantic hurricane season has seen the most named storms in recorded history. Officials have had to start using the letters of the Greek alphabet to accommodate the sheer number of hurricanes in the season. Massive protests broke out in major cities across Colombia on November 19th, despite restrictions put into place due to the coronavirus pandemic. The protests, which were intended to oppose social and economic policies of Colombian President Iván Duque, were peaceful in nature. The demands of the protesters include improved healthcare and education infrastructures, as well as aid for unemployed Colombians and help for struggling families. Sporadic protests have been occurring in the country since September, when a man was killed in a detention center by Colombian police. More protests are planned for December and January of next year. After decades of use, Caribbean authorities have discovered a poisonous chemical in a local pesticide. Many local residents, especially farmers and plantation workers, are outraged as they believe they have been purposefully and knowingly misled for capital gain. Called chloretacone, workers were told to put this white powder-like substance under their banana trees to protect them from insects. Little did they know, this would cause one of the world's highest rate of prostate cancer, among other side effects. French President Emmanuel Macron has given French Muslim leaders 15 days to accept a, quote, charter of Republican values, following 3 suspected radical Islamist attacks in 1 month. The organization to which the ultimatum was issued, the French Council of the Muslim Faith, has agreed to create a national council of imams, which can issue and withdraw accreditation to local imams. President Macron has also announced new initiatives aimed at combating Islamist separatism in France, such as restrictions on homeschooling, issuing children identification numbers, and a ban on the sharing of personal information. State secularism is central to the French national identity. Freedom of expression in schools is considered essential, and perceived attempts to protect one religion or another from criticism is believed to undermine national unity. The Vatican is investigating its Instagram account after the Pope's official Instagram page liked a photo of a scantily clad model. According to a Vatican spokesperson, it is not believed the like originated within the Holy See, and the Vatican has turned to Instagram for an explanation. The Pope's Instagram account is followed by 7.4 million people, and the page is managed by a team of employees, and an internal investigation will be conducted. The model featured in the picture has made light of the incident, saying she is glad she is, quote, going to heaven. As the crisis in Ethiopia unfolds, the head of the World Health Organization is on the defensive. WHO head Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus is being criticized for allegedly supporting the Tigray People's Liberation Front. This comes after Ethiopia's army chief claimed Ghebreyesus helped the TPLF procure weapons. Dr. Tedros is from the Tigray region and was the health minister of Ethiopia under TPLF leadership. In a tweet, he disputed the claims and said, quote, "I want to say that I am only on one side, and that is the side of peace." Multiple people are dead after protests in Uganda turned deadly on November 18th. Protests were sparked after celebrity and presidential candidate Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobby Wine, was arrested for violating COVID restrictions. 16 people were killed in the protests, along with 65 injured and over 350 people arrested. Wine is only one of 11 candidates aiming to take down the decades-long president of Uganda on the January 4th election. Along with Uganda, mass protests were also sparked in Thailand. Thousands of unhappy Thai citizens took to the streets on November 19th to express their disapproval of their government. The protest was mainly due to the rejection of a new reform by the country's parliament, but they claimed they were also taking a stand against police brutality and the removal of their monarch. Protesters took to a police station in Bangkok and threw paint on it while police took shelter inside. Almost 40 people were injured, with no deaths reported so far. And in lighter news, a big fin squid was spotted in the Great Australian Bight by marine researchers, marking the first time the animal has been seen by Australian waters. The squid was found during a marine survey. The sighting marks just the third time in history the creature has been sighted in the southern hemisphere. Big fin squids have only ever been sighted 12 times and tend to prefer darker waters. The squid's long tentacles are considered to be their defining characteristic and can grow up to 23 feet in length. Due to the squid's elusiveness, little is known about the species. Scientists say the new sighting may lead to an increased understanding of the habitat of the creature. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Connor Donnelly. Connor?
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. A new vaccine out of England is showing promising results in initial testing. The vaccine was developed by the University of Oxford in partnership with pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca. Early testing indicates it provides a 70% protection rate, while researchers say it could hit 90% with some adjustment. The United Kingdom has pre-ordered 1 million doses, and the company says it will produce 3 billion doses by the end of 2021. In Denmark, farmers are protesting after the government ordered the slaughter of all minks in farms. The small animal, which is raised for its fur, was found to be susceptible to COVID, prompting concerns of a mutated strain passing back to humans. While the Danish parliament is proposing a temporary ban on fur farming, negotiations over compensating farmers are still ongoing. In South America, Chile has opened its borders to international travel for the first time in 8 months. Chilean President Sebastián Piñera says the country will slowly begin to reopen. International travelers can fly to the capital Santiago but must submit a negative COVID test and agree to 2 weeks of tracking. Chile has faced 500,000 cases so far. Mexico has become the 4th country in the world to pass 100,000 dead. While cases had plateaued over the summer, the infection rate has sharply climbed beginning in September. Over in the east, mass testing began in Shanghai, China, after a series of positive cases at the Pudong airport. Officials say over 16,000 people were tested overnight, while videos on Chinese social media showed a chaotic process when too many workers arrived to be tested at once. China has reported a total of 92,000 cases since the pandemic began. In India, hospitals are struggling to contain a new surge of the virus in the capital city, Delhi. The city alone has over 100,000 new cases since the beginning of November. Doctors fear similar increases may follow in India's other large cities. Over in the Middle East, hospitals in Gaza are near capacity as they struggle for supplies. World Health Organization Emergency Coordinator Abdel Nasser Sobo says it will become unable to care for all critical cases within the week. Israeli Minister of Science Izar Sheh says international humanitarian aid will be allowed into Gaza. Iran, which remains the most heavily afflicted country in the Middle East, has imposed new restrictions but has not implemented a lockdown. The new system tracks COVID hotspots in addition to implementing a national curfew. The new guideline will also include a nationwide mask mandate. Iran's death total has passed 40,000, with the total number of infections over 800,000. And across Africa, the total number of infections has passed 2 million, representing less than 4% of the world's total cases. The African Center for Disease Control says, however, that the total number of cases and deaths is likely larger than reported due to a lack of testing. The most heavily affected countries are South Africa, Sudan, and Chad. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Let's now move to our featured topic of the week, the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. To give us some background on the conflict and for some expertise on what's going on now, I spoke with Dr. Ann Phillips, Senior Advisor to the Nagorno-Karabakh Project for the United States Institute of Peace. We spoke for a significant period of time, and due to the volume of content, Around the World in 30 Minutes will be doing a two-part series on the topic. Tonight, we'll be discussing the background of this conflict, where it began, and the rumors that this could be the beginning of a second Armenian genocide.
Dr. Phillips, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
So my first question for you is really to just get an overview for our viewers and listeners. Can you describe what the situation was between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, why it happened, what it was about before the ceasefire we saw this month?
Certainly. The conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh is really a legacy of the Soviet Union. Armenia, Azerbaijan were both constituent republics of the Soviet Union, and when it began to implode in the late 1980s under Gorbachev, the Armenians, the Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous oblast within the territory of Azerbaijan. And that worked well enough while the Soviet Union still existed. But in the late 1980s, Nagorno-Karabakh was multi-ethnic, but a large majority Armenian, so over 70% Armenian, 24% Azerbaijanis, as well as some Kurds, Greeks, Russians lived in this relatively small territory. Toward the end of the Soviet Union, the Armenian governing council, because it did have some autonomy over local issues, voted to join Armenia to shift the jurisdiction from Azerbaijan to Armenia. And then the conflict between and among the populations accelerated from that point. So after the Soviet Union actually imploded in 1991, there were major fighting ensued between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. I think it's important for listeners to know that this whole area of the South Caucasus is a multi-ethnic area. So there were Armenians living in Azerbaijan, as well as Azeris living in Armenia proper, and so on. And they had lived together more or less peacefully for centuries. So this view, or this action taken to shift the jurisdiction of Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia set in train a series of conflicts that the region has been living with so far. A major war ended between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 1994. Some 30,000 people were killed. Almost 1 million people were displaced. Most of the displaced were Azeris, although Armenians were displaced as well. The suffering on both sides was horrendous, was enormous. And at the end of that war, the Armenian military occupied Nagorno-Karabakh itself, as well as 7 adjacent territories, all of which reside within Azerbaijan proper. So it's not a border conflict in the sense that Nagorno-Karabakh was on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but all of these territories resided within Azerbaijan proper. International law, the international community never recognized Armenian authority over the occupied territories or Nagorno-Karabakh. So that's sort of the setup of this situation. This is often, Nagorno-Karabakh is often called a frozen conflict. I would say a simmering conflict is probably more apt, because since 1994, there have been border skirmishes along the line of contact, which is that the border between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, as well as there in 2016, there was a fairly substantial war short-lived, but in which Azerbaijan was able to take back a small slice of its territory. And then there was an outbreak of violence in the summer of 2020, and in this summer. The other one was April of 2016. In July of 2020, there was another conflict, but not along the line of conflict, but between the undemarcated border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which appeared to be actually more of border patrols catching each other by surprise. And that ended quite quickly. The war that broke out at the end of September of this year was the first major conflict since 1994. In that interim period, the Minsk group was set up by the the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was mandated with the responsibility of setting up a framework and helping to facilitate the two parties to the conflict, Armenia and Azerbaijan, to reach a durable peace agreement. There were numerous times, 2001, 2011, when both sides appeared very, very close to reaching an agreement. And unfortunately, for the victims of conflict, that they both failed. And I think part of the reason, or a significant part of the reason, is that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, leaders on both sides, Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders, defaulted to nationalism. Nationalism as a way to win public support for their positions, and also to deflect from domestic problems as well. This is not unique to this region. This you see in many parts of the world. The Balkans is one, and so on and so forth. And we see this in former Central and East European countries that were part of the Warsaw Treaty Organization have done this as well. So the emphasis on nationalism in a way pitted both sides against the other in a zero-sum game dynamic, which made compromise for the leaders on both sides very, very difficult, as we saw in 2001, 2011, and a number of other times when the leaders seemed close to reaching a mutually acceptable agreement to this conflict.
For those of you just tuning in, we're here with Dr. Ann Phillips on Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Dr. Phillips is a senior advisor for the United States Institute of Peace. And right now we're in the midst of sort of a history lesson. And I'd like to get back to that. Can you tell us a bit about the Armenian genocide, which happened from 1915 to 1923? And some political leaders right now are claiming that the current conflict is reminiscent of such times. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yes, of course. And the experience of the Armenians, this was a trauma for Armenia, and beginning really in 1915. As the listeners will remember, this was during World War I. And the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the modern Turkish state didn't exist at that time. The Ottoman Empire were on conflicting sides in World War I. And the Armenians, actually the South Caucasus in many ways, caught between the two, territory to exchange sides and so on. From the Armenian point, 1.5, the numbers vary, but roughly 1.5 million Armenians were killed during this extended conflict. As you say, it didn't really end until the early 20s. Both the Russian and the Ottoman empires had dissolved by that time as a result of World War I. So the Armenians had tried very hard to expand their territory. They were beaten back in that effort, and so much suffering, so much human suffering, of course, during World War I on all sides. But the Armenians, this is a particularly salient, trenchant historical experience, which Armenians do not forget, and the narrative carries on from generation to generation. No one is alive now who experienced that directly, but the memories of that are passed on from one generation to another. The Armenian leadership, the modern day leadership, Nikol Pashinyan, the prime minister of Armenia, referenced the genocide in discussing or in his appeals for international support, Russian support, international support to protect Armenians from the Azerbaijani effort to complete the genocide. These were the terms in which the Armenian leadership presented the conflict. They argued this was an existential threat to the survival of Armenia, and so on. And of course, the Turks and the Armenians are ethnically and linguistically related. I have not seen any evidence that that was the objective of the leadership in Baku. And President Aliyev never said such a thing, nor did Erdogan that I have seen. So, but I see that as means to have, the Armenians, and the Armenians talked about willing to fight to the last drop of blood to protect their territory, their survival, and so on. I see that conflict and the Azerbaijani aggression, if you will, in a much more limited vein. That from Baku's point of view, they wanted to, and they've made very clear consistently, to reclaim the territories that they see as rightfully theirs, not to exterminate the Armenian people per se. So this is part of, however, and it's very important because perception is really, really important, that it was part of the effort of leaders on both sides to whip up nationalist sentiment and to maintain nationalist sentiment in that war. So that, of course, made the truce agreement that was signed on November 10th of this month for the Armenians and for Prime Minister Pashinyan, as well as the de facto leaders of Nagorno-Karabakh, particularly painful, because when you paint the conflict in such absolute terms, then the challenge going forward is, how do you walk this back? How do you walk this back? So that is how this is my personal view. This is not an official USIP reading of the situation, but the rhetoric on both sides, demonizing each side, is common for military conflict, most unfortunate, because at the end of the day, the Armenians and Azeris will have to reach some kind of accommodation, and the parameters of that is set out in the agreement, the truce agreement that was reached, as I mentioned, on the 10th of November of this month.
I think my biggest question for you, with all that being said, is, why does Azerbaijan feel the need now to reclaim that territory? Why, if that region, as you say, is more populated by Armenians, why now do they feel the need to take it back?
Oh, yes, a very good question. Well, part of it, a key element of it, and the Azerbaijani leadership was very public about this, their growing frustration with the failure of the Minsk process to make any progress. So, and as you probably recall, when Nikol Pashinyan was swept into power by a very popular wave pushing for reforms and all of these good things, one of the things, in addition to anti-corruption and a number of other reforms that Prime Minister Pashinyan spoke about, he also spoke of the need to reach an agreement on the Nagorno-Karabakh that was agreeable to all sides. So the Azerbaijanis, the Armenians, and of course the Armenians that are the really almost 100% of the population in Nagorno-Karabakh, because everybody else had been driven out. So the Baku had, or President Aliyev, there was great hope, I think, on the Azerbaijani side, that now they finally had somebody in a position with whom they could negotiate. And it's important to remember, of course, Pashinyan came to power. He was elected in December of 2018, if I recall correctly. And in early 2019, Pashinyan, Aliyev met a number of times. They talked about confidence building measures, preparing the populations for peace on both sides, very important part of a durable peace. But Pashinyan began, perhaps with his first visit to Nagorno-Karabakh, to strike a much more uncompromising tone when he said, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, using the term that Armenians use, is Armenian, period. And this already backing away from a willingness to compromise. And Prime Minister Pashinyan actually said in an interview after the November 10th agreement was reached that if we had accepted an earlier compromise, perhaps we would have returned 5 out of 7 Azerbaijani districts. We would have still had primacy in all of Nagorno-Karabakh, including Shusha. But now we have not. But, as he said, the Armenian population would not have accepted this. So you see the risk, the danger of constantly reinvigorating a nationalist narrative, and that which in turn hamstrings you to make compromise, which would at the end of the day be in mutual interest. So what the Baku leadership saw was that not only Pashinyan appeared unable to make compromise, he seemed to be walking back some of the things that they had discussed at meetings that they'd had together. But we shouldn't discount some confidence building measures were undertaken. Conflict or outbreaks of fighting along very, very limited along the line of conflict had been reduced significantly because of confidence building measures, direct communication between military as well as political leaders and so on. So there'd been progress, and certainly I'm sure that the populations, the civilian populations living on both sides of the line of contact really appreciated that. But the rhetoric began to escalate again. From the Baku perspective, Armenia was consolidating its settlements in the occupied territories, which, by the way, international law does not recognize, and the international community did not recognize. UN Security Council resolutions from the very beginning called for the return of those territories. So I'm not inside the head of President Aliyev by any means, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that from Baku's perspective, that time was running out, and that Nikol Pashinyan did not have the capability of making compromises. And so that was disappointing, no doubt. And that from the Armenian side, it appears to me another equally important miscalculation. And that is, despite UN Security Council resolutions, despite the parameters of the Minsk framework for negotiating a durable peace, which called for the return of the occupied territories, which called for the return of the expellees, both Armenian as well as Azerbaijani, but the overwhelming majority being Azerbaijani. All of these things have been discussed for decades, And perhaps the Armenian leadership miscalculated in thinking that if we just waited out, our authority over this territory will be ultimately recognized. And there is, of course, precedent for this in other parts of the world. You think of Israel's continued occupation of territories which have not been recognized by international law, but from the 1967 war, they're still there and expanding. So could have been big miscalculations on both sides, but led to the trigger of, for Azerbaijan, of just saying now or never. And of course, the Azeris, or the Azerbaijan government, had been engaged in building up its military capabilities. The military loss as a result of the 1994 war was a great humiliation and loss of territory and so on. So I think that tells us a bit about why now. Why now?
Thank you to Dr. Ann Phillips with the United States Institute of Peace for that expertise. Tune in next Monday to hear more from Dr. Ann Phillips about what's going on right now in the region, what lies ahead for both sides, and the international community's reaction. That will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to producer Cassidy Slamman, reporter Connor Donnelly, and researchers Daniel Gall and Matt McDermott. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.